The house was already quiet when my father called my name. Not the kind of quiet that comes late at night. This was different. Heavy. Still. The kind that makes you feel like something has already happened, even before you know what it is. I remember standing at the end of the hallway, my school bag still on my shoulder, wondering why my heart was beating so fast for no clear reason. I hadn't been caught doing anything. Not yet. But somehow my body already knew. "Bring your bag," he said. No anger, no shouting, just a calm voice that made everything worse. I stepped into the living room. My father was sitting at the table, the same table where rules were discussed, where decisions were final, where silence always won. The light above him was on. The rest of the room was dim. "Put it here," he said, tapping the table. I placed my bag down slowly, too slowly. He noticed. "Sit." I sat. He didn't ask questions, didn't accuse me of anything, didn't tell me why. He simply reached for the zipper. That was the moment fear stopped being an idea and became physical. I had told myself many times that nothing like this would ever happen, that I was careful, that I knew how to hide things, not just objects, but thoughts, choices, parts of myself. I was wrong. The zipper sound cut through the room like a blade. He opened the first compartment. Books, notebooks, pens. Normal. I breathed again, just a little. Then he moved to the smaller pocket and stopped. His hand didn't freeze dramatically. He didn't gasp. He didn't react at all at first. He simply looked down at what was inside, his expression changing so slightly that most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did, because I was watching his face the way people watch weather when they know a storm is coming. He didn't pull anything out. He just closed the bag, slowly, and then he looked at me. I had imagined many versions of this moment in my head, shouting, anger, punishment. What I hadn't imagined was silence. "How long?" he asked. That was all. No object named, no accusation, just two words that told me everything had already been understood. I didn't answer, not because I was being defiant, but because my throat refused to cooperate. He nodded once, as if my silence itself was an answer. "This house has rules," he said. I had heard that sentence my entire life, but that night it landed differently. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact, like gravity. "I didn't raise you to be careless. I raised you to be honest." The word honest hurt more than anything else, because I knew in that moment that this wasn't about what he found. It was about trust. He stood up, picked up the bag, and carried it to the corner of the room. He didn't throw it, didn't slam it down. He placed it there like something fragile. "Go to your room," he said. "We'll talk later." Later. That word stayed with me all night. In my room, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't even move much. I replayed the scene over and over in my head, trying to find the exact moment where things went wrong. Was it the decision to keep something I knew wasn't allowed? Was it the confidence that I wouldn't get caught? Or was it something deeper? The belief that I could live one life in front of him and another outside his sight. The truth was uncomfortable. I hadn't just broken a rule. I had crossed a line I didn't fully understand yet. Hours passed, or minutes. Time didn't feel normal that night. I listened to footsteps in the hallway, doors opening, doors closing. Every sound felt amplified, like the house itself was holding its breath. When my father finally knocked on my door, I was sitting exactly where I had been before.
"Come," he said. Back in the living room, the bag was still in the corner, untouched. He sat down again. This time he didn't open it. "I'm not angry," he said. I looked up, surprised. "I'm disappointed," he continued, "and disappointment lasts longer." That sentence settled into me slowly. He explained calmly what the rules of the house were, not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. He talked about responsibility, about choices, about how freedom isn't something you take, it's something you earn. I listened, nodding, barely breathing. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You think this is about control," he said. "It's not." He paused. "It's about who you become when you think no one is watching." That was the moment something shifted, because I realized this inspection wasn't random. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't paranoia. It was a test, and I had failed it. He told me there would be consequences, not immediately, not impulsively. "I'll decide tomorrow," he said. "You'll think tonight." And just like that, the conversation was over. No punishment announced, no shouting, no resolution, just waiting. I went back to my room, knowing that whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It would be quiet, intentional, and impossible to ignore. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of what he would do, but because I was afraid of what this moment said about me, about the person I was becoming when rules felt optional, when authority felt distant, when I believed consequences were for other people. I realized something uncomfortable in the darkness of that room. The inspection didn't expose an item. It exposed a gap between who I was pretending to be and who I was becoming. And once that gap is seen, it can't be unseen. By morning, the house was still quiet, but it was no longer calm. It was waiting.
Morning came without announcement. No alarm, no raised voice. Just the soft sound of movement in the kitchen and the weight of unfinished business pressing down on everything. I got dressed slowly, my mind replaying the previous night in fragments. The zipper, the silence, the word honest. At breakfast, my father sat across from me like any other day. He drank his tea, read a few lines of the paper. The routine was intact, but it felt staged, like a familiar play where the ending had been rewritten. "Eat," he said, noticing I hadn't touched my plate. I forced myself to take a few bites. Food tasted like cardboard. After a long pause, he folded the paper and set it aside. "I've decided," he said. My shoulders tensed. "There will be consequences," he continued, steady and measured. "Not because I want to punish you, but because choices need weight." He stood up and walked toward the corner of the room where my bag still sat. He didn't open it. He didn't point to anything inside. He simply picked it up and placed it back on the table between us. "This," he said, resting his hand on it, "will stay here." I looked up, confused. "For the next 30 days, your routine changes. You'll come straight home after school. No detours, no excuses. Your evenings will be spent here, studying, helping around the house, and thinking." I waited for more, something harsher, something dramatic. It didn't come. "No phone after sunset," he added, "and no leaving the house unless I know where you're going and why." That was it. No yelling, no humiliation, no spectacle. Just limits. "You can disagree, but you will comply." I nodded. What else could I do? As I left for school, I felt the eyes of the house on me. The walls hadn't moved, but the boundaries had closed in. Every step felt measured now, watched. At school, everything looked the same, but I wasn't. Friends joked, laughed, planned things for after class. I smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, but my thoughts were somewhere else. 30 days. It sounded manageable. It felt endless.
The first week was the hardest. I came home straight after school, watching the clock as if it might move faster out of sympathy. My phone sat on the desk like a taunt until sunset, then disappeared into a drawer my father locked without ceremony. He didn't lecture, didn't hover, he simply expected compliance. That expectation weighed heavier than punishment ever could. In the evenings, he gave me tasks, simple ones, real ones, fixing things around the house, organizing shelves, helping prepare meals. At first, I resented it. It felt like busy work designed to remind me who was in charge. But over time, I noticed something strange. He worked alongside me, not supervising, participating. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't hostile. It was focused, purposeful. One night, as we worked quietly, he said something without looking at me. "You know why I didn't shout?" I shook my head. "Because shouting is easy. It releases anger, but it doesn't teach control." I didn't respond. "I want you to learn how to sit with the consequences of your decisions, not fear them, understand them." That idea unsettled me. I had always associated consequences with pain or embarrassment. This was different. This was sustained discomfort, quiet, consistent, unavoidable. Days passed. The routine began to settle in. I still felt restricted, but the sharp edge of resentment dulled. I started noticing details I had ignored before, the way my father organized his tools, the precision in how he planned his day, the discipline he applied to himself as much as to me. This wasn't a performance. This was who he was. One evening, I asked the question I had been holding back. "Why do inspections happen?" I asked. He paused, considering. "Because trust isn't built on hope. It's built on verification." I didn't like the answer, but I understood it. The second week brought frustration of a different kind. I missed things, invitations I had to decline, moments I felt absent from. I watched others move freely while I moved carefully, every action documented by the rules now governing my life. At night, I lay awake thinking about the item he had found, about how small it was compared to the impact it had created. It wasn't about the thing itself. It was about what it represented. A decision made in secret, a boundary crossed quietly, a belief that I could control outcomes without accountability. That realization stung. By the end of the third week, something shifted again. The anger I had carried began to turn inward, not as self-hatred, but as reflection. I asked myself questions I hadn't before. Why did I feel the need to hide? Why did approval matter so much? Why did rules feel like cages instead of safeguards? One evening, my father noticed the change. "You've been quieter," he said. "I'm thinking," I replied. He nodded, as if that was the intended outcome all along. The consequence wasn't designed to isolate me from the world. It was designed to return me to myself. By the end of the month, the routine no longer felt like punishment. It felt like structure, something I had taken for granted when it was always there. On the final day, my father handed me my phone back without ceremony. No speech, no announcement. "This doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was," he said. "It means you decide what comes next." I held the phone, surprised by how light it felt. The real weight wasn't in my hand. It was in the choice now placed in front of me. The inspection had started something neither of us fully understood at the time. Not a conflict, not a rebellion, but a reckoning. And I was only beginning to grasp what it would require of me. The rules didn't end when the 30 days did. That surprised me. Not because my father extended them, but because I didn't want them gone the way I thought I would. When my phone returned and the drawer was unlocked, I expected relief, freedom, a rush of normalcy. Instead, what I felt was hesitation, like someone stepping back into noise after spending too long in silence. I realized something unsettling. The routine had changed me. I was more aware of time, more careful with words, more conscious of decisions before I made them. That awareness followed me everywhere. At school, I noticed how casually people broke rules, not big ones, but small, constant ones. Lies told easily, promises bent without thought, boundaries crossed because no one was watching.
I used to be part of that without thinking. Now I saw it. Friends asked why I had disappeared for weeks. I shrugged it off, kept explanations vague. They were parts of that month I couldn't explain without exposing something personal. Some lessons don't translate well. They're meant to be carried, not shared. At home, the dynamic between my father and me had shifted again. He didn't inspect my bag anymore, didn't check drawers, didn't ask where I was every hour. But he watched differently now. Not suspiciously, attentively, as if he were waiting to see what I would do with the space he'd given back. One evening, I came home later than usual, not late enough to break a rule, but late enough to be noticed. He didn't ask questions. He just looked up and said, "You're cutting it close." "I know," I replied. That was it. No argument, no lecture. And somehow that restraint felt like more responsibility than the rules ever had. I started realizing that strictness wasn't always about control. Sometimes it was about preparation. My father didn't want obedience. He wanted judgment, the ability to pause, to consider, to decide with intention instead of impulse. That understanding didn't come all at once. It arrived in moments, quiet ones. Like the afternoon I found myself standing in a store looking at something familiar, something that would have felt harmless before. I stood there longer than necessary. No one was watching, no inspection was coming. The choice was entirely mine, and that was the moment it mattered. I walked away, not because I was afraid of getting caught, but because I didn't want to return to that version of myself, the one who believed secrecy was freedom. That decision surprised me. Later that night, as my father and I sat in the same room doing separate things, I spoke without planning to. "I think I understand why you did it," I said. He didn't look up immediately. "Did what?" he asked. "The inspection," I replied. "The consequence." He paused, then closed the book he was reading. "It wasn't about catching you," he said. "It was about slowing you down." I nodded. "I was moving too fast," I admitted. He studied my face for a moment. "Fast feels like freedom," he said, "but it's usually just momentum." That sentence stayed with me, because momentum can carry you places you never intended to go. Over the following weeks, our conversations changed. They became less about rules and more about reasoning. He asked what I thought, why I chose certain things, what I believed the outcome would be. He didn't correct me every time. Sometimes he let me be wrong. That was new and difficult, because being wrong without immediate correction forces you to confront your own logic. You can't hide behind authority when you're the one holding the reins. I failed a few times, made decisions that didn't turn out well, misjudged situations, overestimated myself. But each time my father didn't say, "I warned you." He said, "What did you learn?" That question changed the tone of everything. It turned mistakes into tools instead of verdicts. One night we talked longer than usual. He told me about his own youth, about choices he didn't get to make, paths that were decided for him by necessity, not preference. "I didn't grow up with options," he said, "so when I had you, I tried to give you structure instead." I listened, seeing him differently, not as a gatekeeper, but as someone who learned survival before he learned flexibility. "I didn't always get it right," he admitted, "but I never stopped trying to protect you." Protection, that word landed differently now, because I understood that control is often a language people use when they don't know how to express fear. Fear of loss, fear of regret, fear of watching someone you love repeat mistakes you never recovered from. I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious about him, about myself, about the space between intention and impact. The inspection had forced a pause in my life, but the pause had created room. Room to see patterns, room to examine impulses, room to grow without a rush. By the end of that season, something fundamental had changed. I no longer felt like I was living under rules. I felt like I was living with them, choosing which to keep, understanding why others existed. The forbidden item was gone, but the lesson remained, not as fear, as awareness. And awareness, once gained, doesn't fade easily. It follows you, quietly, into every choice that comes next.
What surprised me most wasn't how much I changed. It was how much space suddenly existed between us. Not distance born from conflict, but from adjustment. For years, my father had been present in every decision I made, not hovering, but anchored. His expectations were always there, shaping my choices before I fully understood them. After the inspection and its aftermath, something loosened. He stepped back. Not dramatically, not bitterly, deliberately. At first, I mistook that distance for withdrawal. I wondered if I had disappointed him beyond repair, if the inspection had created a crack we were both pretending wasn't there. The house felt quieter in a different way now, less tense, but more hollow. We moved around each other with care. Conversations became practical. Schedules, meals, weather. Nothing personal, nothing deep. And that silence unsettled me. One evening, I found myself lingering in the doorway of the living room, watching him organize papers at the table. The same table, the one where the bag had rested weeks earlier. I wanted to say something. I didn't know what, so I stayed quiet. Later that night, I realized the truth. This distance wasn't punishment. It was trust. He wasn't watching me anymore. He was waiting to see what kind of person I would be without constant guidance, waiting to see if the lesson would hold when he wasn't enforcing it. That realization brought pressure of a different kind. It's one thing to follow rules when someone is watching. It's another to live by principles when no one is. I started noticing how often I paused before acting now, how instinctively I measured consequences, not because I feared being caught, but because I didn't want to betray myself. The house rules hadn't changed on paper, but their purpose had. They were no longer boundaries imposed from above. They were reference points I could choose to honor or ignore. That freedom came with responsibility. One afternoon, I faced a choice that tested everything. It wasn't dramatic, no inspection, no confrontation, just an opportunity to bend a rule quietly, to do something I knew I could get away with. No one would know. No consequence would follow. I stood there longer than necessary, weighing the moment, and I realized something important. This choice wasn't about my father anymore. It was about me. I chose not to cross the line, not because it was forbidden, but because I understood why it was there. When I came home that day, my father looked up briefly and nodded. That was all. But that nod carried more meaning than any lecture ever had. It told me he saw the change. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us shifted again, not closing completely, but softening. We began talking more naturally, sharing small details, observations, opinions. He asked questions, not to test me, but to understand how I was thinking. I noticed he corrected me less, and when he did, it wasn't with certainty. It was with curiosity. Why do you think that? What made you choose that? What do you expect will happen next? Those questions weren't traps. They were invitations. Slowly, I stopped feeling like I was being evaluated. I felt like I was being included. One evening, as we worked on something around the house, he spoke without looking up. "I didn't want you to fear me," he said. "I wanted you to respect yourself." That sentence reframed everything. Fear demands compliance. Respect demands understanding. He continued, "Rules are temporary. Judgment is permanent." I understood then that the inspection wasn't the event that mattered most. It was what came after. The waiting, the silence, the decision to let me struggle with responsibility instead of shielding me from it. He had chosen patience over control, and that choice required trust. Trust I hadn't earned before, but was earning now. The distance between us no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like space given to grow into. I started taking more initiative at home, at school, in life, not because I wanted approval, but because I wanted alignment between who I was and how I acted. I failed sometimes. When I did, my father didn't step in immediately. He let the discomfort do its work. And when I finally came to him, confused, frustrated, uncertain, he listened,
not as an authority, as a guide. That shift was subtle but profound. It changed how I saw him and how I saw myself. The house no longer felt like a place of rules. It felt like a place of accountability, a place where actions mattered, not because of punishment, but because of character. By the end of that season, the distance between us had transformed into something else. Not separation, balance. We weren't standing on opposite sides anymore. We were standing apart by choice, connected by understanding instead of enforcement. And I realized that sometimes the most powerful lesson a parent can teach is knowing when to step back.
The bag was never inspected again. Not because my father stopped caring, but because the inspection had already done its work. Life didn't return to the way it was before that night, and it didn't need to. What replaced it wasn't stricter rules or tighter control. It was something quieter, heavier, and more lasting. Expectation. Not his. Mine. I carried it with me without realizing, into decisions that seemed small at first, into moments where no one was watching, into choices that no longer felt like tests but reflections. The house felt different now. Not softer, not looser, clearer. I noticed how my father moved through his own routines with discipline that never asked for applause, how he followed rules he never spoke out loud, how his standards applied to himself just as much as they applied to me. That observation changed my perspective. This had never been about authority. It had been about consistency. One evening, months later, we sat at the table again, the same table where the bag had once been placed between us like evidence. This time, there was nothing on it but 2 cups of tea. He didn't bring up the past, neither did I, but the silence between us wasn't tense. It was settled. "I trust you," he said suddenly. Just 3 words. He didn't explain them, didn't attach conditions, didn't look for a response. He simply said them and returned to his tea. I felt something tighten in my chest. Trust isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly after you've proven you can carry it. That trust didn't make life easier. It made it heavier. Because now there was no one to blame, no rule to hide behind, no inspection to anticipate. Only choice. And choice demands honesty. Over time, I realized something else. The forbidden item, the thing that had started everything, had faded from memory. Not erased, but irrelevant. What remained was awareness, the understanding that freedom without judgment is just impulse, and judgment without empathy is just control. Somewhere between those 2 extremes, my father had tried to place me. He hadn't done it perfectly, neither had I, but perfection was never the goal. Growth was. Years later, when I found myself in situations where I had authority over others, whether at work, in friendships, or within my own family, I thought back to that night. Not the fear, the pause, the decision to slow things down instead of escalating, the choice to let consequences speak louder than anger, the patience to wait for understanding instead of forcing obedience. That lesson followed me everywhere. I learned that real discipline doesn't humiliate, it clarifies. It shows you who you are when no one is forcing you to be better. My father never told me that directly. He showed me, by trusting me when it would have been easier not to, by stepping back when stepping in felt safer, by allowing distance so responsibility could grow. The bag inspection didn't break me, it didn't harden me, it didn't push me away. It slowed me down long enough to see myself clearly, and that clarity changed everything. Today, when I look back, I don't remember the fear first. I remember the silence, the calm firmness, the absence of anger, the weight of being seen not as a child to be controlled, but as a person in the process of becoming. That was the real consequence, and it was the one that stayed.